welcome to today's webinar. My name is Victoria Owusu-Boateng, and I'm with the Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory. Please, am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So I welcome you all to Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory, our very first webinar this month. And today we are going to talk about Africa-China, what's it called? We are going to talk about reimagining Africa-China's cooperation post the Africa Leadership Summit that was held in Washington, D.C. Today, I have three distinguished speakers here that are all, they are great in their irrespective, discourse. They know what they are talking about. We are going to be talking about the China's BRI. We're going to be talking about FOCAC, the Forum for Africa-China Trade, and then we're going to talk. We have a speaker who is going to tell us more about the U.S. Africa relations. Before we start, we go ahead with a few housekeeping rules. That is, if you have any questions, kindly put them in the Q&A, and I'll be reading the questions to my, my speakers here who will give us the great answers. We also want to know, we're going to start quite shortly, please.
Okay, you're back. Yeah.
Hi, so sorry about that. So in December 2022, U.S. President held this Africa Leaders Summit where he invited almost all African presidents to the United States to discuss more about the U.S. Africa's relations. And now we can see a lot of even the U.S. president's wife is in Africa, and a lot of things are happening. Now we want to know much about the renewed interest in Africa from the U.S. At the same time, too, we have a really awesome relationship between China and Africa, right? And how does Africa benefit from all this? Can we use it to our advantage? So today we have Kai. Kai is very learned when it comes to China's BRI. And China's BRI is simply China's Belt and Road Initiative. When the China's Belt and Road Initiative was launched 10 years ago, a lot of people thought China was very ridiculous. Like, why would you create a Belt and Road to connect all countries together? So we have Kai here, who I'm going to read a brief of himself, and he is going to tell us more about China's BRI. So just a second before we get into it. Sorry, just a second. Okay, so Kai Xue is a corporate lawyer in Beijing. And before I forget, Kai is joining us all the way from Beijing on this webinar. Kai is a corporate lawyer in Beijing, and he frequently advises in the Belt and Road Initiative. financing matters and merger and acquisition in African mining. He has advised transactions in major countries in East Africa and West Africa, and also southern part of Africa. And the project that he has include paving roads, factory investments, expansion of hospital construction, and construction of solar-powered maize mill, and many other pieces of vital infrastructure. Kai has written frequent China's relationships with Africa and has been quoted in the Wall Street Journal, Reuters, BBC World Service, and L'Afrique, Le Monde Afrique. Before starting his corporate career, Kai briefly worked as a criminal defense clerk at a law firm in Mombasa, Kenya, helping represent suspected Somali pirates trial before the Kenyan courts. Welcome, Kai, to this webinar. And this webinar is brought to us all by the Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory. And before you start, please, I'd like to tell our viewers that if they have any questions, they can put it in the chat box, and then we will talk about the questions. So a warm welcome again, Kai, and you have the floor, please.
Thank you so much, Victoria. And also, thank you so much for this opportunity, because I read so much news about the Belt and Road, and also I push so much paperwork related to the financing for the infrastructure. So I can get lost in the details, but now I have this opportunity to, just to digest everything for myself and to maybe come up with some simple insights.
Okay.
So, well, I would like to break down my thoughts into 3 sections.
Okay.
Number 1, just to recap what's going on. Number 2, I want to point out something to watch out for right now that's happening with Belt and Road and its competitors. And 3, I would like to have a suggestion about what I think might be optimal African strategy to get the most benefits out of the Belt and Road and from the competitors to the BRI. So, as everybody knows, a lot of transportation and power infrastructure has been built in Africa, and it, at the center of it has been 2 policy banks. China Development Bank and Export-Import Bank have advanced a lot of loans to African governments to build this infrastructure, from just countless road projects to the more headline-grabbing standard gauge railway in Kenya. You have so I don't need to go down the statistics of all these projects. I would instead like to focus on just talking about a few obscure road projects that nonetheless had grand significance in terms of African connectivity. So it has been for over a century an ambition in Africa to see that there is a road, a highway from Cairo all the way to Cairo to Cape Town. And actually, sometime around 2016, it actually it was actually connected. And this had virtually no fanfare whatsoever, because what happened in the period of 2016 and leading up to it were just a few obscure road projects in Kenya and Tanzania that had some Chinese participation, for instance, as the construction contractor or as the financial institution advancing the loan to fund the project. And when these 4 projects were finally completed, voila, 10,200 kilometers from Cairo to Cape Town was connected by highway. So I really like that example, because it gives a sense of how both that these projects at the local level, they certainly help all those farmers within a few kilometers of that road get their products to urban markets and increase their incomes, but it also lays out this tangible, grand vision of connectivity across the continent. So a lot has been built so far over the past 20 years and also the past 10 years in the Belt and Road. And now there has been a new phase where there's fewer projects and quite a bit more criticism of the projects. And that is because the US has, globally challenged China. And unfortunately, one of the theaters is Africa. And even more unfortunately, of course, this interest, this renewed focus of the US with the Leaders Summit in December, it was based on this, it was inspired by the competition presented by China and the need of the US to feel the need to address it so that it would not be left behind. But unfortunately, it's not entirely healthy, this competition, because, for example, what would be healthy competition, of course, is if the US were to present a counteroffer, right? If it were to also advance loans with, more competitive terms to build the same kind of infrastructure that is needed. And of course, you do hear about these announcements at the G7 about the rich world coming together to also present a package of infrastructure financing. But so far, it's really just an announcement. Instead, what you see a lot of now is just simply maligning China by the US government and also the US media and Western media. And to give you a good example of this. So back in December 2021, there was FOCAC, which most of us know is every 3 years, the leaders of China and Africa come together to discuss a plan for the next 3 years. And it's mainly based on more infrastructure development. So around December 2021, when this summit was being held in Senegal, unfortunately, there were a lot of global headlines about Chinese lending for the expansion of the Meng airport in Uganda. And it presented that loan as just all sorts of negative connotations associated with that project and the loan. And when I was reading those headlines, I was very puzzled because I thought it was a really good bargain. It was a low interest loan. It was subsidized by the Chinese government, and that the Meng airport has to be expanded. So when I spoke to the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times about it, I found the reporters to be quite attentive, and they were willing to research this issue deeply. But nonetheless, I was still disappointed by what the the focus of their story was. For instance, quite a few paragraphs in both the Wall Street Journal and the FT story focused on what I consider the very trivial, nitty-gritty detail about infrastructure financing, which I felt it would not be paid attention at the detailed level, but it would nonetheless sustain this idea that there were all sorts of negative connotations surrounding that loan. And unfortunately, that sustains this narrative against Chinese lending and the Belt and Road in Africa, so much so that earlier in this month, if you were reading the Washington Post, the editorial board had an opinion published about Chinese lending, and it characterized it as predatory, which I think is unfair, and it's based on flimsy stories like what happened in December 2021. And this is something, and by the way, I see a hand raised, but if I could be given a few more minutes, and then I'll get to Mr. Jamila's question.
Sure. Questions will be, we'll give room to people to answer. So please, if you have any questions, you can list them in the chat box, and then we'll address that shortly. Thank you.
So this is what I mean by something to watch out for. In that You know, these are flimsy stories that create a negative narrative. And unfortunately, bad information like that will hamper African development. Because if you know, let's go along with what I'm saying is that it was a good bargain, that subsidized loan for the expansion of the main airport in Uganda. But if there's this negative atmosphere surrounding a good bargain, then I think in the future, in finance ministries across Africa, there will be unnecessary suspicion towards Export-Import Bank of China lending. And of course, the bureaucrats will be weighing all sorts of options for financing and investment of critical infrastructure. And if there is a lot of bad information that unnecessarily attacks Chinese financing options, that would in turn elevate other options which have their own downsides and which tend to get ignored if all the focus is on piling unfairly against one option. And so I believe the outcome will be to lead finance ministries across Africa to lean towards worse options. And that will hamper African development, the outcome of this bad information. So that leads into what I would recommend is my recommendation for the optimal African strategy during this new era of renegotiation of debts, of loans that have already been dispersed and infrastructure that has already been built. So, I mean, I don't mean to say that to block out, you know, oh, just please block out all criticisms of Africa, I mean, of Chinese lending in Africa. That's not at all what I mean to say. Because to have that criticism, as long as it's well researched, you know, clear and not propaganda like, it will, you know, it helps create optimal situations, that fair criticism. But if, you know, not only if it's unfair, or either if it's fair or unfair, I think after listening to that Western media criticism, African leaders and the public should then ask their Western counterparts, well, what's your counteroffer? And what I mean by that is something like the announcement at the G7 by the US and Europe that they were also going to offer a lot of infrastructure lending. And presumably, if they believe in this debt trap narrative, they would offer it on better terms, like a lower interest rate. Well, you know, they don't have a good track record of delivering. You know, they issue the press releases with the huge numbers, but just like President Obama's Power Africa initiative, you know, it's pretty puny actually. The amount that is amount of deals that are done and what gets done. So this is something I think Africans should watch out for, which is, you know, don't simply accept fair or unfair or even outright propaganda by Western countries as the complete form of competition. That's really cheap, right? If all they can do to push out China from Africa is just to offer propaganda, you know, so what Western media or governments say, the question that should follow is, well, what's your counteroffer? Because you should either equal or exceed what China is offering now if you want to be a real competitor. Because, you know, there are dismal consequences, I think, to all of this if propaganda does work. Let's say China doesn't get its loans repaid, and the goodwill that was initially generated from, you know, construction of all that infrastructure dissipates because of all the attacks that are piled on. And I think what that will mean is, in the next 20 years, the amount of Chinese lending for much needed infrastructure will be much less than in the past 20 years. And if that lending disappears, then I think Western competitors, the US and Europe, will feel secure in their hegemony, and they will once again marginalize Africa as they have done before, because the competition is gone.
Right, thank you very much. That was very insightful. And I have some few questions. I don't know if you would, have a question. Okay, so questions will be, I'll tell you the questions after. Now let's go on to our second speaker. Hi, Maria.
Hello, hi.
How are you doing?
I'm
Maria
good.
is joining us all the way from Shanghai, and Maria is with. Hello.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, as you're getting ready, I'll be reading your brief. So, Maria is. Hi, Maria is an assistant professor of Global China Studies in New York University, Shanghai. She has her research that explores the history of international law in East Asia and investigations on how China's rise as a global power shapes norms and redefines the international distribution of power. She co-leads the research initiative Mapping Global China and is the author of Sovereignty in China, a genealogy of a concept since 1840. And she's the co-editor of the China Questions 2, Critical Insight into U.S.-China Relations, that's HUP 2022. Before joining NYU Shanghai, she was a recipient of a three-year Marie Curie Fellowship at the KU Leuven. She was also a fellow at the Italian Academy of Columbia University, Princeton, Harvard, China, and the World Program, Max Weber Program of the European University Institute of Florence and New York University Law School. Welcome, Maria. Can you give us more insight of the 2022 U.S. Africa Leaders Summit that was held in Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. And I'm glad Kai Shui already introduced a bit of the BRI. So I will talk more of the US strategy to counter Belt and Road Initiative and China in Africa. So the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit was hosted by Joe Biden last August in Washington, D.C. from the 13th to the 15th of December. And 49 leaders, African state leaders attended, as well as the head of the African Union Commission. And today in my presentation, I'm just giving a background, because I think to understand this summit, you need to understand what happened before in US-China US-Africa relations. And so I will discuss about the complicated history with back and forth interest, the moving away from sort of disregard to partnership. There's been this emphasis on partnership in the past years. And then the reasons really that are behind this initiative, that very often it's very reactive to China and Russia. But let me start with the complicated history. So during the Cold War, Africa was seen as a sort of field for the Cold War, was a peripheral territory that, again, was seen as marginal to the main conflict between Western powers and the Soviet Union. And then things started to change with George Bush Sr. and Clinton, where everything seemed possible in this new world order, where political liberalization conditionality to help started to be implemented, in contrast to previous client state and Soviet sphere of influence mentality. Then there was a disengagement and to reach the status quo, in particular in the crisis with Somalia in October 1993, where at least 18 US soldiers died. And then there was a quick retreat from Africa, from the US, starting with a withdrawal from Somalia in 1994 and the Presidential Decision Directive 25, which will restrict future US intervention. That was represented a dramatic setback from before, right? This larger engagement. And then the US also challenged the genocide characterization of the Rwanda genocide. The US also tried to justify its non-intervention, even if the Geneva Convention had been clearly violated. And already here, the responsibility started to be shifted to local actors, and the economic support largely went to peacekeeping operation, but with really small amount. And what followed, like this sort of disengagement, was a virtual engagement, which with again support for peacekeeping operation, which were both seen as disengagement because they did not really include American troops, and also as an interference, as the operation had to be endorsed by the United Nations. And one of the key interests remained oil, especially as the US kept relying more and more on it, going as far as calling it its national interest. And in 2007, the importance of China as the volume of trade has started drastically picking up between the two regions, started to be a sort of a source of concern. But then Obama also rhetorically was very supportive of Africa, but then not much change in terms of actions. Then there was a big shift with the Trump administration, who even called Haiti an African nation a shitholes country. So rhetorically was very bad. And even Bolton, when he launched the new policy toward Africa, mentioned more time China than African countries, key African countries. And so this is really to show how reactive all the new interest toward Africa has been. And then during the Trump administration, there was this Blue Dot Network and Build Act. Build Act was with Biden, but in 2019 was this Blue Dot Network that tried to create, to promote new standards in Africa to counter the Belt and Road Initiative that has been perceived and portrayed as promoting poor standards of governance, and the debt trap. There's also this debate about the debt trap that was very much pushed by the United States. Although there's not up-to-date clear evidence that China had pushed for a debt trap, has put, and I don't think myself, having done research myself with Sri Lanka or Kenya, there's no evidence that China is plotting to put this country into a debt trap. Then Biden launched this Build Act, and later in 2022, last year at the G7 meeting, the US launched this partnership for infrastructure, for global infrastructures, and committed $600 billion in the arc of 5 years, again to counter China. And the key driver for this is, like, at least rhetorically, is to promote high standards, good governance, democratic values, really in contrast with China. However, this, and I'm happy to talk more about this, there's a lot of rhetoric, but no substance yet, not real substance. It feels really as a slogan, as a sort of label that contrasts BRI, that has been rebranded. All this sort of initiative and things that already existed have been rebranded to counter the Belt and Road Initiative. And then with Biden, there was a new strategy for Sub-Saharan Africa, and also this African Leadership Summit last December. And they tried to reverse the damage brought on by the previous Trump administration, to the reputation of the USA in the region, but also went further than that in their commitments. And the U.S. Africa strategy highlights the importance of the region again and again. So this is very positive, with an accent put on civil society, and used a strong rhetoric of partnership and listening, and promises to use the African Union as an interlocutor. And so this is a bit different from before, because Africa has always been seen as the country to aid, to help. This time is trying to kind of following China model of equals, like win-win, we are all equal, we are partners. And so I think the US is kind of trying to copy partly that. And the strategy not only acknowledge the climate change and the by consequence for Africa, but promises also to use in part the private capital to plug Africa infrastructure gap. However, there are several issues with it, such as an absurd separation between Northern Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, which makes no sense for countries such as Botswana or Djibouti. Also, civil society still fails to encompass the non-governmental actors, such as small business associations or union. And there are many other issues, such, for instance, the unnecessary slow visa regime for non-immigrants from Africa in the USA, that of course it goes against all these commitments. And the Africa Leaders Summit proved to be a very positive signal in the midst of a very difficult context of COVID and Ukraine and inflation crisis, with numerous significant announcements that have been made during this summit. The most important announcement was the support for the G20 to include the African Union as a permanent member, the unprecedented 55 billion pledged, the close cooperation with the African Union's Agenda 2063, political support for an inclusion of an African country as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, and the promise of a presidential tour of Africa. So all this is very good. However, the issue is whether anything of this will really take place, because again, there's a lot of commitment, a lot of rhetoric, even going back to Obama, but a lot of lack of substance sometimes. And also there is this other specter, this reactive nature of this Africa Summit leaders, and also the new Africa policy, that there is this, the key objective, the key goals, it doesn't feel to be Africa, but more China and the rivalry between US, China, and Russia. And can the US compete with its new rivals? I think it's difficult because China has been investing for so many years in Africa, and it has a rhetoric that goes of non-interference, of South-South cooperation that dates back to Bandung Conference. And African countries are very reluctant to align themselves against Russia, despite Ukraine invasion, and suffer from the inflation derived from it. So it's kind of interesting. And so these are my last two slides. So has the US lost the global South and Africa? So partly yes, I will say. And I think China has cemented this political relationship with countries in Africa and other regions, and also countries with the global South. If we look at the Afrobarometer national survey of 34 countries between 2019 and 2021, we see how Africans hold positive views of China's assistance and influence on the continent. So its perceived level of influence on African economies has went over the past 5 years. And Africa has become a key region for China in the Belt and Road Initiative since the third forum on China-Africa cooperation in 2006. China-Africa relations have flourished, and China has become Africa's largest trading partner in 2019. And FDI flows into Africa grew at an average of 40% per year. Although last year there was a steep decline, especially the peak was in 2016, and after that there was a steep decline of Chinese investment all over the world, including in Africa. And 2013 is a key year for US because China overtook US FDIs in Africa. And so we also were witnessing some tectonic geopolitical shifts And so we see how also voting partners of African countries are shifting more, and they're much more aligned to China than US or Western countries. And there is also a lot of interest in countries, including African countries, to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organizations. And there is this kind of new international order that it might be emerging, and where the global South plays a very important role, including Africa. And so the support of Africa for this, multipolar order that has China more at the center might emerge. And the way forward for America, I think for the US or Western countries, is to take into account the global South in its own terms and not just looking at it as a territory for competition, like kind of going back to the Cold War. And they really, I think we have to take into account how African sees the world. And again, not just treating it as this backyard, this peripheral territory. It's also very important to substantiate promises. Think about Africa in an integrated way by taking advantage of the African Continental Free Trade Zone that connects the dots with a focus on small, medium-sized, and very small enterprises. And then I think it will be very helpful to stop thinking in a zero-sum game. And I think from a US perspective, it's still better to engage China and include it in the rule-making process rather than creating silos. And then it's also better to map out and coordinate efforts, especially with the European Union. And that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. The questions will follow up shortly. Now let's move on to our next speaker from all the way from Nigeria. That's Mr. Rilwan Umar Masood. Mr. Rilwan Umar Masood is currently an academic staff at the Ahmadu Bello University in Zaria, Nigeria. He is an enthusiastic researcher on China-Africa relations and the international political economy of the Africa-China relations. He is an advocate of policy stratagem in China-Africa relations as it relates to development, trade, aid, FDI, and political institutions. He is also a researcher of the Nigerian capitalism, as well as its variants in other regions of Africa. Welcome, Mr. Rilwan, and the floor is yours for your presentation. And before you go ahead, if you have any questions, kindly keep them in the chat box. Right after Mr. Rilwan's presentation, we will go into the Q&A session. And so far, there are so many interesting questions popping up. So, Mr. Rilwan, you have the floor, and you can start your presentation right now. Hello. Hello, Mr. Rilwan. Okay. Can we take few questions? Before Mr. Rilwan comes, maybe you could take few questions. Oh, Mr. Rilwan is here, so let's go ahead. Hello, Mr. Rilwan, you can have the floor now.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry for the bit of entanglement. I was trying to share my screen, and I think I'm running into a few, technical issues. But of course, I will go ahead and present, my talk of the event today, which is on reimagining China-Africa relations post U.S. U.S. Africa Summit, right? Which was held last November last year, and sorry, I can't share my slides, but maybe I will share it after, and you can distribute it through email to people, so that they can be able to follow up with what you're trying to do. Anyway, my task today, based on the program, is to speak on China's approach to Africa post U.S. Africa Summit, right? And the question is, can FOCAC serve as an important strategic role in AFCTA's success. That's the Africa Free Continental. Can you hear me?
Can you please turn on your video?
Yes, I can.
Okay, it's off. So can you please turn it on?
Can you see me now? Good. Okay, good. So my topic is to, my area is to discuss China-Africa relations post U.S. Africa Summit. Okay, can FOCAC serve an important strategic role in Africa Free Continental Trade success, right? And I mean, why this is important is because if you listen to Joe Biden's introductory speech at the U.S. Africa Summit, he hinted that the U.S. is going to help Africa in trying to ensure that the Africa Free Continental Trade Area succeeds, right? And some of the things he said he is going to help in doing is aiding in the construction of the AFCTA's, secretariat. I'm not sure of in which country, but of course he said he was going to do that. And this points to one very important thing. If you look at China and how it has been engaging with Africa, you find out that the BRI, as Shui started to talk about, is a very important policy document that looks to ensure that formerly, ancient trade routes that has to do with China are brought back into life, so that trade can flourish across, the world. And it has to do with China, of course. China is the center, and then there are other areas of the world where it plays with formally, and it is going to develop that. And some of these things are also in Africa. You find out that there are African countries, especially the East African, center, where you find out that these trade routes affect Africa, of course. Okay. So what I'm trying to say here is it is an important issue, and infrastructure is a very important issue for Africa, especially because if you look at the deficit in terms of infrastructure for Africa, you find out that deficit is about 60 to 30. Okay, 60 in the negative and 30 in the positive. So you see, it's a very important issue that needs to be discussed. And of course, FOCAC, which is the Forum on China-Africa Relations.
Hello, Mr. Rowan.
Yes.
I have your presentation here, and I would like you to turn on your video, and I'll follow up with your presentation. I will help direct your presentation.
Okay. Well, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, fine. The issue is I'm looking at the slides on my phone, but I can't share it. That's why you don't see me on video.
Okay, so
is it okay?
I'll be directing the slides from my end.
Yes. So I'm on point one now. What Forum on China-Africa Relations is, okay? So FOCAC as an important institution that can ensure aid, especially, and FDI comes into Africa, is a formal institution through which China engages with African countries, okay? And doing that, they do it multilaterally and sometimes on the sidelines, bilaterally, okay? And they discuss different themes, based on the different conferences that are there. The earliest and first one was done in 2000, okay, which was the founding FOCAC, which was there, in the early 2000s when, African leaders met in Beijing to start to kick off the FOCAC program, okay? And the latest one was done in 2020 in Dakar, Senegal, okay, which, of course, there was a plan of action that was set that is going to run from 2022 to 2024. Okay? And some of the themes of relations between China and Africa are on infrastructure development, digital economy, customs, market supervision, and technology transfer. Okay? So these are all important issues. And now I'm moving to the second aspect of my slides. I'm done with FOCAC, and now let's talk about aid in infrastructure. The FOCAC is an important institution that I mentioned has been looking to engage African countries and contribute, towards developing things like infrastructure, human development, human capital development, and the rest. And FOCAC is an important institution that can guarantee that. Okay, and the crux of it is to ensure that the AFCCA, succeeds. And by doing that, how do they move about to achieve that? Okay, we find out that already through FOCAC and especially the BRI, we find out that there are different projects, infrastructural projects in transportation that have been there, in Africa, sponsored by China. Okay, we speak of the Ethiopia-Djibouti Railway, the Tazara Railway from Zambia to Tanzania. Okay, these are interlinking infrastructure across the continent. Okay, and why I'm emphasizing infrastructure again is that infrastructure is the bloodline or lifeblood of trade, right? Trade and economic growth. And if China can continue to ensure that these infrastructural projects continue to come into Africa and they develop it, such as the railways and also things like the North Saharan highway in West Africa to North Africa, North South Africa, and also West East Africa roads, okay, can be put into good repute, and they can be put into the right frame of the right and positive way or where it should be. You find out that China will definitely help in ensuring that the EFCCA succeeds, since the regions are going to be interconnected with lifeblood transport. Okay, these things are going to be enhanced, and by doing that, we find out that the EFCCA has a high chance of succeeding, since there are interlinkages of transport all over the country. Okay, three, we talk about enhancing good governance. Okay, if you listen to what Biden said, he spoke about good governance on the African continent. Okay, and traditionally, the things you hear about Africa is that good governance is at the backbone of African affairs. Okay, you hear of things like corruption, especially, including in my country, in Nigeria. Yeah, okay? Corruption is one of the major issues that are there. Okay, and anybody who means well for Africa will come to help Africa in ensuring that good governance succeeds. And how do they do this? It is by transferring those institutions in their countries that succeeded in ensuring good governance succeeds to Africa. Okay, there are mechanisms that are there in China, for instance, okay, about corrupt practices and how to curb them. Okay, these things can be brought in, and once they are brought in, bottlenecks and other things that will scuttle trade can be, addressed. And by doing that, economic growth will be on the upwards trajectory. And by doing that, once all the wealth has been generated, there can be aggressive poverty eradication campaigns in Africa. Okay, so good awareness is important, and FOCAC can help in ensuring that good governance as a virtue is pursued and the goal is achieved. Okay, the next one I'm speaking about is climate action, which is the fourth on the series of things I'm talking about. This, and that's the second to the final. Climate action. Okay, Biden also talked about climate action, and if you look at China's relationship with Africa through FOCAC, vis-à-vis the AFCTA, you find out that climate action is not at the foremost priority in the relationship between the regions, between Africa and China. Okay? You find out that it is there, but it is not much talked about. What you hear about mostly is aid in infrastructure, okay, aid in security, security apparatuses, aid in ensuring peace, succeeds, and also other things such as technology transfer. Okay, these things are there, but climate action, it is at the back corner. And I think if China, wants to succeed and counter the US, I think it should bring climate action to the fore. Okay, because we are in a situation where our children and our grandchildren will come to, to not forgive us because of what we did not do, in terms of climate action. When the climate later in life, becomes unbearable. Okay, and by doing that, how can China, ensure that climate action succeeds? Okay, I think one of the ways is for it to bring in new innovative ways of curbing the menace of climate change, okay? And ensuring that things are environmentally friendly, okay? So for instance, what they can do is to bring in sustainable means of transportation. Again, transportation is important, okay? You bring in sustainable means, okay? Now we are in the era of, electric vehicles, okay? Other things like solar power, solar powered vehicles, or even solar powered factories and the rest. So if these things can be brought to the forefront of FOCAC's agenda, I think China can be able to ensure that FOCAC, vis-à-vis the AFCTA, ensures that Africa complies with its climate action mandate, okay? And it's an important issue, for our future generations, okay? And my final slide, which is on China can partner the US in building regional HQs of the AFCTA. The first or second or third thing Biden talked about was building the AFCTA's headquarters, okay, in a certain African country. I'm not sure if it's Ethiopia or elsewhere, but I'm sure it is going to be in Ethiopia, okay? This is a very good development, okay? And I think rather than, China competing with the US in this regard, rather, I think they should cooperate. They should cooperate together, okay? Competition doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, okay? I win, you win. I win, you lose. No, it is a win-win, okay? If great powers of the world feel, that Africa is a continent where we can help them in ensuring that they reach their potential of greatness, okay, and economic success and prosperity, one of the ways of doing that is cooperating, okay? And that's why I'm advocating that this HQ that Biden says is going to be, built in Africa, especially in Ethiopia. I think the China can partner with the US and build regional HQs, headquarters of the AFCFTA, okay? And why is that? Once there is some form of decentralization of, command, okay, or supervision, there's a tendency that, there is enough supervision which will ensure the success of the AFCFTA, okay? By doing that, the regional bodies can look into their regions, okay, and coordinate them, okay? They coordinate them and ensure that all the other HQs, also report to the main HQ. And while they do that, you find out that it is efficient, okay? Everything that is centralized doesn't tend to, go very far, okay? Things become very slow, things become too cumbersome, and, a division of labor is very good, okay? And if China can partner with the US in doing this, they can build regional HQs. And by doing so, you find out that, everybody, is happy. And you find out that the AFCTA, will succeed, on the region, okay? So just a final concluding say, you see, I understand that, competition is good, for, ensuring that we innovate, and create success. Is that right? Yes, we can do that and create success, and get out of problems. It is good, okay? But for me, as an individual and based on my creed, I don't think competition should be a zero-sum game, okay? And that is why I like China a lot. I'm talking to Kai Shui here, okay? I like China a lot because China ensures that everybody wins in the end of the day, okay? I win, you gain, okay? So everybody is happy, okay? Not that I win and you lose, and someone is unhappy and somebody is happy, okay? So everybody should win. Everybody should come and do his own very good, agenda and ensure that everybody is happy. And by doing that, the world will be a better place, okay? So I think I'm at the conclusion of my talk, and thank you very much for inviting me for this talk, and I'm very happy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rowan. Thank you very much to all our speakers. Now we've heard about the Belt and Road Initiative. We've heard of the U.S. Africa Leadership Summit, what's happening, and now we can see that, and we've also heard from Forum of what's it called, China Africa Relations as FOCAC. Right now, we want to have this discussion as we move on to we move on to the question and answer session. Now we see interest from both China and also from the US. They all have interest in Africa. Now, do you think that this is a time for Africa to also leverage who they are going to draw towards? Because we had our relationship with US and the West in the past, and then now we have like a loyal, responsible partner with Chinese. And after some time, just as Maria mentioned, that during the Trump administration, there was this fallout between the US and Africa. And happily we had China on our side, right? So do you think this is a time for Africa to position itself properly to, you know, and what's it called, bring out your demands, say this is what we want to, you know, this is what we want on the table. We are going to do everything in our terms instead of you telling us what to do. We have some questions over here. Would any of you want to give your feedback on what I've said? And before I delve into the questions, who will go first? You could have the...
I will, if allowed. Yes. Okay, may I?
Yeah, you can go ahead, Mr. Rowan.
Okay. I mean, from what you just asked about Africa positioning itself, you know, in relation to China, Africa, and also US, you know, Africa relations. I mean, who should they trust or who should they align with? Okay. I don't think they should align themselves with one and forget one. No. You know, these people are coming, okay, or even if you feel they are not coming here to help, they are here to offer something, right? They are here to offer something. Don't just take one side and leave the other. No, you can take the good from here and the good from there and put them together. Okay. And by doing that, you gain. And you know, and there's no loss here, okay, by taking both sides. The EU also, you know, has its own global gateway, right? Which is there to also offer monies, you know, and opportunities for development of the African country. The African continent should not just say no because it is Europe and historically you people came in and, you know, colonized us. Why should we trust you again? Okay, fine, there's a trust issue, but of course you should dialogue with them and hear what they have to offer. And of course, if they offer something good, why not take it and put it in your, you know, in the development of your country? Okay, so don't just take sides. You know, take everybody along, and you know, just let's be friends. Okay, everybody. The world have moved away from that. We are all friends. Okay, we have moved away from that colonial mentality, and you know, so everybody should come. Let's cooperate and ensure the world, you know, is a better place for us to live in. Thank you.
All right, any other additions? I have a question for Mr. Kai. In his presentation, he made mention that when China started showing interest, especially with the Belt and Road Initiative, it came as like the West and the US were thinking that China is being a predator, especially when it comes to lending so much to Africa. What are your thoughts on that, Mr. Kai? And do you feel that China is being a predator when it comes to Africa? And what is your stance on this Africa-China-US relations as well? Mr. Kai.
Yeah, so I mean, that predator term, it came right from the source in Washington, which is the Washington Post editorial board. The Washington Post is a newspaper that has a special relationship with the U.S. government, as it's, you know, sometimes even proudly boasts. And so that I take as now the new party line emanating from Washington about how to characterize Chinese lending, that it's predatory. And I can't find an objective basis to that. And what I mean by that is I view Chinese lending as simply comparable to either the market terms that, let's say, Standard Chartered Bank London branch, if it were to advance a loan to Uganda to build an airport, And in fact, another airport in Uganda is financed that way, that it is no different or actually better terms. And in fact, a certain segment of Chinese lending is explicitly subsidized. In fact, that very much maligned loan to expand the main airport in Uganda was subsidized. It was low interest. So I really have a hard time finding the basis for all these attacks. And so I think the attacks are just generated purely from a destructive instinct to take down the competitor without caring about any second order effects.
Okay, so I have lots and lots of questions in our Q&A. So let's get right into it. So the first question is, I don't know who is going to take it. It states that, is the U.S. Sub-Saharan Africa strategic statement in August 2022 aimed directly at China's activities in Africa? And what African issues are the focus of both the U.S. and China's attention? Maria, I think you should take this one. It says that the U.S. Sub-Saharan Africa strategic statement in August aimed directly at China's activities in Africa. What African issues are the focus of both the U.S. and China's attention?
Thank you. So I think that again, as I said in the presentation, a lot of U.S. Africa policy is driven by China, not by Africa necessarily. So it's very reactive to what China is doing. U.S. U.S. continues to be focused on civil society issues, and now it's shifting focus on infrastructure with Biden and Trump to counter the Belt and Road Initiative. But it's very, it doesn't really have a broader strategy. I think China has more of a integrated strategy, so to integrate whatever infrastructure it does or special economic zone with global supply chains that benefit China, or resources also that benefit China, and it's more on equal terms. And I think China is interested in resources, in soft power, promoting its own soft power in Africa. This there's this whole rhetoric of South-South solidarity as well, that they are not. They have shared history, and and I think it's a bit different, the kind of issues that are interested in. But again, we can see how US is shifting more towards also hard infrastructure that were not in the debates until recently.
Mm-hmm. Okay, another follow-up question that I wanted to ask. Do you think that US can match up to China when it comes to the Africa relations in the near future? Because you said that in your presentation that US has now lost to China when it comes to Africa, Africa relations and the global South. But do you think in the near future are they going to match up to China in any way?
I think it will continue to be partly different. I have trust that if the US really puts its head on it, they will be very successful. So if it's truly a priority and they really want to improve the relationship in a significant way, or improving infrastructure, I'm sure they can do it. There are a lot of smart people. But the thing is whether there is a true commitment to really, is it truly that important? If it is, I believe that the US still have a hold on Africa. Even if you look at Afrobarometer, US is still the favorite model, the preferred model. And I think most African people still think that learning English is more important than learning Chinese, despite all Chinese effort. So it's not lost. I think it's just not, it's counterproductive to use this Cold War also rhetoric so you have to choose me or China. So that's really not the way forward. But I think that it can happen. I'm not sure whether it will, but if there is real commitment, I have trust that the US will be able to, regain confidence and rebuild connections with Africa.
Okay, so there's a question for, thank you very much. There are some questions for you, Maria, but I want you to rest a bit. Let me go on to Rowan and then to Kai-Shue. So for Rowan, the question is, what effect will the ongoing election in Nigeria have on Nigeria's relations with major countries like the US or China? Hello.
It's a very good question. Yeah, I'm here. It's a very good question, and I'm even happy, the person asked this question. It's an important question for us here in Nigeria, who are in the process of electing a new president. Okay, and yeah, it's an important issue. I think the election, the outcome, whosoever comes into power needs to step up and engage China again, as a development partner. Okay, a development partner, as China usually says. Okay, and the fallback of the election is just to ensure that there's a step up in cooperation with China and ensuring that there's more synergy in terms of the issues that are there, across the board in the global south. Okay, poverty eradication, greenhouse emission, and things that have to do with security, especially. I think in Nigeria it's a very important issue. Security. Okay, we are in a perilous situation right now where there are some vagabonds who are out there, attacking infrastructure, including ones used by China out there. Okay, and I think if China can step up and include and transfer, things such as technical know-how on how to fight asymmetric warfare and other things like using technology such as satellite tracking, technology, and also what do you call it? And also surveillance, for instance, on all this infrastructure like railways that are there in Nigeria, constructed by China. I think if the new president can ensure that China comes in and plugs the gaps in these areas, I think it will be a very good step forward, for Nigeria. And even, it can even move beyond Nigeria to other countries in Africa. Thank you.
Okay. This one is for Kai-Shue, and the question is, what is new in China's Africa policy after the recent Chinese Communist Party's Congress? And also another one that says, does China's territorial disputes with neighboring countries have any impact on Africa? Yes.
Well, it was 4 months ago, so that was in October, and I can't think of any direct changes, and also I'm sure there might be second order effects, but nothing spring to mind. As to territorial disputes, well, first of all, we have of course, the need to maintain the one China policy, and but there's not much controversy over that because there's just one UN member state in Africa still that's a holdout, and also Somaliland, is trying to attract some attention by supporting Taiwan. So, but that's trivial stuff. As for any other territorial disputes, let's say in the Himalayas or in the South China Sea, I don't see how it doesn't really pull in Africa much.
Okay.
Of course, it'd be nice to have, at the UN General Assembly, some support if it ever comes down to that.
All right. This question, I don't know if it's to the whole house, to all of you here, and it goes like, besides China and the US, there are many other players on the African chessboard, such as France. President Macron is visiting some African countries in West Africa. So how do these interplay competitive synergies impact Africa's role today? Who is going to take it? It's open. Maria, would you like to go for it? Or can I read the question again? It says, beside China and the US, there are other players on the African chessboard, such as France. President Macron is visiting some African countries in West Africa. And so how do these interplay competitive synergies impact Africa's role today?
Yeah. So there is
Okay.
Yes, so there is an increased interest in Africa. Also, the European Union, actually, we didn't mention it at all, but also the European Union launched a series of initiatives that have been rebranded last year, 2 years ago, with the Global Gateway. And also the European Union committed 300 billion euro to investments all over the world. And a lot is meant for Africa. They also rewrote a new strategy that also emphasizes the partnership part, that we are more equal on equal terms. And then, of course, you have old colonial powers that have a lot of interest in preserving this kind of ties with Africa, including France. But this is also needs to be read also within this broader European Union frameworks, and there is Turkey, there is Japan, there is Korea, there is Russia. There are so many actors active in Africa. There is not just China, but China, I think what is impressive is like how is present anywhere, like in Africa. There are all these databases that shows Chinese investments, and it's quite remarkable. And it has been successful. It's at the center of debates and rhetoric. But yeah, we need to remind ourselves that there are a lot of different actors there. And also to understand what China is doing, it's very important to keep in mind a comparative perspective, right? Because sometimes we treat China as an exception, but probably is not. So both historically, we want to compare what China is doing, but also in the present, what other countries are doing in Africa and how China is different or similar.
Mr. Rowan, would you like to add anything to this question? Like the many players in the African
Yes.
chess.
Okay, yes. I think speaking of synergy and speaking of France, you see there's this complex that is happening, between especially Francophone countries and Africa and France, sorry, There's this feeling amongst these countries that France is still a colonial player in their political, affairs. You understand? And you find out that there have been coups in countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and the rest. And if you listen to what the juntas are saying, what they are saying is that France should stop interfering in their affairs. Okay. And, they are free to choose. Right now, we are in the age to choose what we want to do with our country. And France should stop interfering. Even the currency, the CFA, needs to be changed so that it will be African. You see, there's a feeling of, distrust with France anymore in these countries. Okay. And I think rather than this happening, France needs to step up in the framework of the EU, as Maria said, in ensuring that these countries fall back into, the catchment of their, not influence, but of their cooperation. Okay, these countries should fall back into the catchment of their cooperation by ensuring that, fears are allayed, we are in partnership, we're in cooperation to ensure that everybody succeeds. Okay, this is the way forward. And speaking of, as she said, there are so many other players of the Brazil, the BRICS, right? Russia, Brazil, China, everybody else, all these big players, India and the rest, they are here in Africa, and they are also trying to ensure that they further their own agenda, including things like soft power. Okay, soft power, ensuring that they influence people like them, they are attractive to everybody, they are loved. And by doing that, they can get inroads in economic terms and also in other terms such as social and cultural relations. Okay, so I think these players need to synergize more. Okay, right now we find out that it is more of in a competitive way. Like for instance, between China and India, you find out that these two players who are neighbors. Yes, who are neighbors. Sometimes you find out that they don't have the best of relationships and they are competing. Okay,
Yeah.
but if they can synergize better, okay, we are friends. Everybody is a friend today in the world. From here, I can call Kai in Beijing by a WhatsApp call or Facebook or anything, and we'll talk, and we are friends. And I will learn from you, and you will learn from me. Likewise, Maria, I'll call her. You know, everybody is friends. So that way, there needs to be more synergy. Of course, everybody should ensure that there is that cooperative framework that we fall onto, not the competitive and zero-sum, game that is being played right now. Thank you.
Okay, one more from you, Mr. Rowan. It says that what are the aims of FOCAC? The aims of FOCAC for Africa. What are the aims, and what do you hope to achieve?
Okay, FOCAC, I mean, as I said, it's a forum, that is there, an initiative by the Chinese government to engage with Africa. Okay, and Africa is one of African countries are the best friends of China actually in the world right now. You understand? So FOCAC is a very important and strategic, relation between Africa and China in ensuring that there is a win-win, between Africa and China. And how do they do this? Okay, you find out that there are concessional loans granted to African countries via FOCAC. And I mean, the most recent trend is the BRI, where since 2013, where President Xi Jinping promised to develop infrastructure in Africa. Okay, so there's a lot of gain, not only in infrastructure, not only in aid, there's also FDI. Okay, foreign direct investments. China, is moving some of its major companies to Africa, where they can not exploit, where they can be able to gain from cheap labor that is there in Africa. For instance, if you look at Ethiopia-China relations, you find out that there are so many companies, like I think there's these shoes, not Puma, what's the name? I can't remember the name, that are being, that are there in Ethiopia being manufactured, but they are Chinese products. Okay, so there's a bit of a FDI trajectory in that. Okay, in Africa, from China. And FOCAC is the major institution through which these kind of deals are pushed forward to Africa. So it's like China is giving a helping hand to its global South partners in Africa through FOCAC. And also African countries are contributing as well to China via raw materials, labor, and the rest. Thank you.
Right.
Cultural.
Yes, we have to be rounding up shortly, and I hope we'll have another webinar session very soon so that we can go more in depth into this discussion. So the last question here before we round up goes to Kai, and it says, can you please comment on whether the USA and European Union actually even have the financial ability to offer significant loans to African countries? And please elaborate on that, as it seems that their private sector banks are unwilling to take such risks in contrast to the Chinese banks. Thank you very much. And this is coming from Mr. Zlatin Mitkov, all the way from North Carolina State University.
Thank you for that question. It's right in my wheelhouse. So for the U.S., certainly, because the U.S. is a very rich country, and it's running huge deficits and doesn't seem to care that much. I mean, if the Pentagon budget can be $800 billion in that region, well, then why can't the USAID or a new agency for infrastructure, why can't their budgets be doubled? It's just a matter of willpower, and part of that willpower can be created by Africa pushing back when they hear this pure propaganda and asking, can you please, offer an actual competition like a counteroffer? As for the European Union, although the EU is merely, rich rather than very rich like the US, it can still certainly afford to do more, but actually what's more compelling for the EU though is they need to do more. Number one, they need to atone for recent mistakes. What I mean by that is right now, the Sahel is in crisis. There's just disasters in every country, thousands of fatalities every year. And you look at the news in Benin, Togo, Ghana, Ivory Coast, and in the last 3 years, in every one of those countries, you see news about incursions across the border from the Sahel causing fatalities in coastal West Africa. And if that grows, it's even more of a crisis. And it's a crisis that Europe is accountable for, because back in 2011, let's recall that President Sarkozy of France rallied all of the Europe to go bomb and topple Gaddafi, who is his alleged co-conspirator in the election bribery scandal of 2007 that got Sarkozy elected, allegedly with bribes from Gaddafi. But in any case, so there needs to be atonement from the European Union for this crisis that's been caused across Africa and threatens much more of Africa by enhancing infrastructure and also doing its part to send combat troops, if necessary, to many parts of Africa where the jihadists, I mean, of course, you have to raise the income of the farmers so they can't be recruits, but there, of course, are going to be also jihadists that need to be neutralized, and there needs to be combat troops from around the world to do that. So the short answer is yes and yes to US and Europe. As to the private sector, there is lending by commercial banks for infrastructure in Africa, like the example of Standard Chartered Bank London branch with the other airport in Uganda. And of course, there are also private investors like Wall Street investment funds. Also, one such fund invested in a hydropower project in Uganda too. And based on reporting I see in the Wall Street Journal a few years ago, that was a financial fiasco for Uganda, and it serves as a contrast to the better stability and results of Chinese lending for hydropower projects in Uganda. And it also reemphasizes this warning I have, which is that if you spread bad information and you just pile on one financing option unfairly, you distort perceptions, and you might lead African policymakers to go in bad directions, which will hamper development. But anyways, back to the original question, which is yes, the commercial banks and private investors do participate, but it is not sufficient, nowhere near sufficient. Please, Victoria, you're muted right now.
Sorry. All too soon, our webinar has come to an end. I thank you all so much for your time. I know it's quite late in Beijing and in Shanghai, but you made time for us to have this very important discussion. Thank you so much, Madam Maria. Thank you so much, Kai Xue. And thank you so much, Mr. Rowan. We hope we could have this discussion again some other time. And to all our listeners or our viewers out there, please watch out for Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory, the ACCPA's webinar. We have lots and lots of webinar series coming up, and we will entreat all of you to kindly follow us on our social media platforms. Join us anytime we have a webinar series. And very soon, we'll be having an offline or live event webinar and seminar, and that will be held in Accra. So we hope that we can count on all of you speakers whenever we call on you, and to all our viewers, whenever we call on you, you attend to our programs. Thank you so much for the discussion. My name is Victoria, and I am a research associate at the Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory. And I hope to see you in our next webinar session. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Good night.